In Kathy Cohen's Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, she has a couple different criticisms. The first is racism within the lesbian and gay communities. The second is an equation of heteronormativity with heterosexuality. And the third is a failure to imagine the ways in which queer can be used as a radically liberatory category that can help build coalitions. So the goal for her is to develop a politics where one's relation to power, and not some homogenized identity, like lesbian, gay, black, or so on, is privileged in determining one's political comrades. So I'm talking about a politics where the non-normative and the marginal position of punks, bulldaggers, and welfare queens, for example, is the basis for a progressive transformative coalition work. So I just call this section Queer Horizons to think about what we think of or what we mean when we use the language of queer. So queer theory generally identifies certain cultural markers of sexuality and gender as fluid instead of stable, static sexual identity and behavior. So the sexual subject, or people's sexuality, is instead constructed and contained by various practices of categorization. And these categorizations tend to marginalize some as deviant or other. Queer politics and queer politics activists took these ideas a little bit further and challenged the multiple practices and vehicles of power that render queer identities invisible and at risk. So we have queer politics and queer theory. The idea is to destabilize collective identities like straight, gay, lesbian, etc. And this is fairly radical for a political movement. It challenges the idea that a stable identity marker is needed to facilitate social action and change. So if we were to look at Marx, for example, a key part of Marx is this self-identification of one with their proletariat class. That is the revolutionary promise. Once you identify and have class consciousness and recognize your membership in a class, then you can facilitate social action and change. But here, the idea is that you instead identify your coalition by virtue of them just being a marginalized member. The actual, fluidity of gender and sexual experience itself is the kind of marker that you need. While queer politics seems like it can be revolutionary, Kathy Cohen's objection is that in its present form, it has not emerged as an encompassing challenge to systems of domination and oppression, especially those normalizing processes embedded in heteronormativity. And for a quick definition, heteronormativity refers to those localized practices and centralized institutions which legitimize and privilege heterosexuality and heterosexual relationships as fundamental and natural within society. The idea that you must engage in certain heterosexual scripts to be considered normal in society. Okay, so why does she think that queer politics hasn't been able to do this? Well, because it is largely focused on a simple dichotomy between queer and heterosexual. And on this ground, sexuality is the primary frame through which individuals pursue their politics. So the idea of sexuality, then, as the single marker that unifies queer people. So what's the solution? Well, we need to move away from activism based on one characteristic of our identity. A single oppression framework, gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, limits the transformative character of queer politics. Now, I put a star here just to remind me that she uses language that is not considered up to date. So we do not call people transgendered. That is not a thing. Transgender is an adjective used to describe people. So someone is a transgender woman or a cisgender woman. Transgender is not a verb. One does not become transgendered. Okay, now that that's out of the way. Leftist queer intersectionality. What do we mean by this? Well, beyond the recognition of intersection of oppressions, there must also be an understanding of the ways our multiple identities work to limit the entitlement and status some receive from obeying a heterosexual imperative. So we can't just say, I'm a black straight person or a black lesbian person or something. We have to also look at how, like, we can't just say, like, I'm oppressed because I'm Black or oppressed because I'm lesbian, for example. We have to look at the way that these multiple identities work together to limit the entitlement and status that we receive, especially in the context of heteronormativity. And that's where queer politics should exist. So how do queer activists think of the lives of women of color on welfare? So they might fit in the category of heterosexual, but their sexual choices are not perceived as normal, moral, or worthy of state support. Are they queer? How do queer activists think of the lives of same-sex sexual orientations, which positions them in the category of queer as queer activists use it, but whose other class, race, or gender categories provide them with membership in and the resources of dominant institutions and groups? Are they really needing of queer liberation? That's the challenge here. What we need is a left framework that highlights the ways in which power structures our identities and outlines the possibilities for the lives we lead. So by definition here, what she means by leftist is just people who understand the struggle for lesbian and gay liberation to be integrally tied to struggles against class oppression, racism, and sexism. So while we might use different political labels, Marxist, anarchist, whatever, we share a commitment to a fundamental transformation of the economic, political, and social structures of society. So while we might be Black, we might be white, we might be Asian, we might be a man, a woman, we might be non-binary, etc. We all share a commitment to the fundamental transformation of the economic, political, and social structures of society so that we do not any longer have oppression based on these categories. This kind of movement steps beyond civil rights movement because it's not really just a matter of expanding and maintaining the status quo. So that's what we mean by left queer intersectionality. What about queerness in the notion of heteronormativity? The crucial identifying feature of queer politics is a rejection of heteronormativity. So that's what she wants to say is the fundamental goal of queer politics. So every person who comes to a queer self-understanding knows in one way or another that her stigmatization is connected with gender, the family, notions of individual freedom, the state, public speech, consumption and desire, nature and culture, maturation, reproductive politics, racial and national fantasy, class identity, truth and trust, censorship, intimate life and social display, terror and violence, healthcare, and deep cultural norms about the bearing of the body. Being queer means fighting about these issues all the time, locally and piecemeal, but always with consequences. Queer existence is about experiencing domination via heteronormativity. But Cohen wants to argue that this is not the same as domination by heterosexuals. Heteronormativity interacts with institutional racism, with patriarchy, and class exploitation to define us in numerous ways as marginal and oppressed subjects. Heterosexuality is, and can be, just one part of this. Deviant sexuality transcends the hetero-queer divide understood as queer activists and theorists have up to this point understood it. That's her point. Non-normative procreation patterns and family structures of heterosexual people have also been used to regulate and exclude them, to exclude those that are hetero. The call for fluid sexual identities, or a political culture of individualism, has ignored the class or material privilege that allows for this fluidity and individualism. So she's criticizing this approach to politics as not being intersectional enough. Furthermore, for some marginalized communities, traditional social identities and communal ties can be important to one's survival, vis-a-vis a racist structure, vis-a-vis white supremacy. Heterosexuals outside of heteronormativity do exist. There's no uniform heteronormativity from which all heterosexuals benefit. Queer means to fuck with gender. There are straight queers, bi queers, tranny queers, les queers, fag queers, S&M queers, fisting queers in every single street in this apathetic countries of ours. So it has taken the work by feminists, lesbians, gay, bisexual, and transgender people of color to complicate and challenge the reductive notions of heteronormativity. It's not just straight and not straight. Queer politics should focus on the way heteronormativity expose individuals to shared or similar oppression based on gender and sexual expression or practices. Now, with respect to race, heteronormativity is deeply rooted in white supremacist ideologies, which seek to use the state and its regulation of sexuality to designate which individuals are fit for full rights and privileges of citizenship and which are not. So she gives some examples of the prohibition of interracial marriages, the regulation of Black relationships, so not recognizing enslaved people as being capable of forming legal relationships, the association of Black relations as undermining sexual restraint, civil marriage, and even offering the road to the end of civilization itself, as undermining white supremacy, male domination, and capitalist advancement. Regulation of Black and Latinx women and their families dependent on welfare is another example. Such women are unable to control their sexual impulses or portrayed as such, portrayed as raising their children or making reproductive decisions or acquiring gainful employment as unable to do these things, unable to effectively use the minimal assistance offered by the state. So it was a system of state-sanctioned white male upper-class heterosexual domination that forced these presumably Black heterosexual men and women to endure a history of rape, lynching, and other forms of physical and mental terrorism. Her point is not that heterosexual people do not experience privilege in ways similarly situated queer people would experience, but that heteronormativity stretches beyond gay and straight in ways that the queer community has not fully recognized, such that certain heterosexual individuals, given their other intersecting identities, experience the regulation of their sexual behavior or oppression on the grounds that their sexual or gendered behavior is non-normative. So the final upshot here: identities and communities are important. They need to be supplemented, though, by intersectional analyses. And upon doing so, we can see how people of color, Black people in particular, Black women in particular, straight Black women, their sexualities and sexual practices could be construed as queer if queer is understood as non-heteronormative. So through the construction of coalitions underneath the shared banner of oppression, because of non-heteronormativity, we can achieve political goals. And she picks out certain things that have been good examples of this coalition building: HIV/AIDS work, the Prison Project, needle programs, etc. So I think that this is an interesting thing for us to think about in the context of this article. To what extent should queer as an identity persist as the grounds upon which we engage in political resistance against oppression? To what extent can we talk about queerness in the LGBTQ sense without talking about marginalization on the basis of color, class, or sex or gender? What's included in the concept of queer? Is queer just the opposite of heteronormative? How expansive do we want the concept? That's largely up to our political goals.